ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Sri Lanka has no enemies in the interstate system. Sri Lanka has no enemies in the domestic sphere. But Sri Lanka does have enemies. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that as far as states go, as far as governments go, Sri Lanka does not have enemies. We do have differences of opinion, but we don't have, we have differences of opinion, and we have, for instance, in the form of resolution, obviously a clash of perceptions, a clash of national interests, but that does not mean that those who are bringing the resolution should be seen as the enemies of Sri Lanka. Nor do I believe that Sri Lanka has, after the defeat of the Tigers, any enemies within its borders. But Sri Lanka does have enemies. Those are not state actors. Those are sub-state, non-state, and trans-state actors. And who are these enemies of Sri Lanka? The enemies of Sri Lanka are the pro-secessionist, politically fundamentalist or militant elements within Tamil Nadu and within the Tamil diaspora. Now, I hasten to add that I am not referring to the whole of Tamil Nadu or even most of Tamil Nadu, nor am I referring to the whole of the Tamil diaspora or even most of it. But I do refer to the very visible, pronounced networks that stand for the breakup of Sri Lanka. Now, what is the difference, one might ask, between those who have moved a resolution against Sri Lanka, which is against the interests of Sri Lanka, and the enemies of Sri Lanka? The fundamental difference is that those states that are critical of Sri Lanka for good or bad reasons do not question the basic legitimacy of the military victory achieved by Sri Lanka and the reunification of the Sri Lankan state in its territorial aspect. There are questions about the legitimacy of certain means and methods, certain incidents, certain tactics, certain episodes during the last war and especially its final stages. But nobody, certainly not the United States, certainly not the European Union, question the fundamental legitimacy of the Sri Lankan reunification of its territory and the defeat of the Tigers. None of those states are uncritical of the LTT. None of them are sympathetic or supportive of the LTT. However, the enemies of Sri Lanka within Tamil Nadu and within the Tamil diaspora are either uncritical of the Tigers or have declared or tacit sympathy for the LTT, at least for its cause, if not for its methods. And their project is in fact a continuum, on a continuum with that of the Tigers. Now, I must make clear that I do not believe the government propaganda that all of these criticisms of Sri Lanka are the work of what it inelegantly calls the LTTE rump, by which I believe they mean the rump faction of the LTT. Now, if the LTTE rump is capable of getting Congressman Elliot Engel to write to John Kerry and also get politicians in Malaysia to protest against Sri Lanka, well, firstly, that's one pretty large rump, as rumps go. And secondly, if anybody has to worry, because it's obviously a very active rump, it's not Mahinda Rajapaksa, it's Beyonce. So I don't buy into this whole thing about the LTT rump. The LTT network internationally is one of the components of the coalition of enemies of Sri Lanka. But it is not necessarily the driving force at the present moment. Now, what this means is that there is a Cold War being waged against Sri Lanka by the external enemies of Sri Lanka. And the strategy of Sri Lanka's enemies is to use the gap between Sri Lanka as a state and the other states in the global interstate system. The gap between Sri Lanka and India, the gap between Sri Lanka and the United States, the gap between Sri Lanka and the states of Europe, and most dangerously, the gap which opened up visibly last year in Geneva between Sri Lanka and its own natural global constituency in the global south. So, the external network of Tamil separatism is using those gaps, widening the gaps, and hoping to leverage the great strategic weight of the United States and of India against Sri Lanka. What is the strategic goal of the enemies of Sri Lanka? The goal is nothing less than the reversal of the historic victory achieved by the Sri Lankan armed forces in 2009. It is nothing less than the achievement by other means, by non-military means, though the end game may in fact be coercive, of the military victory of the Sri Lankan armed forces, the Sri Lankan state. The goal is the reversal of the defeat of the project of Tamil Eelam. Now, when Prabhakaran was making his last stand, he made two miscalculations. He thought, and this we know from the writings at the time of Anita Pratap, who was very close to the Tigers, but also other Indian journalists, he thought that the political process in Tamil Nadu, and therefore the political process in India, and the newly formed liberal democratic administration in the United States would combine to create a balance of forces which would prevent a Sri Lankan military victory and provide an opportunity for an exit for the Tigers. This is why he held the civilians with him. Now, Prabhakaran's gamble failed. And though elections in India were in the immediate offing, and though Tamil Nadu was very, very restive, India supported Sri Lanka, not only in finishing the war, but in deflecting an effort by the United States to evacuate initially the civilians, but an effort in which the goalpost shifted, and there was in fact talk by the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, about a negotiated settlement after David Miliband went across to New York. So India supported Sri Lanka in deflecting that effort and ending the game in a decisive and conclusive manner. Now, something went wrong between then and last year when India voted against Sri Lanka. And it is in this gap that the enemies of Sri Lanka are now operating. And the gap, I must say, seems to be widening. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in the domain of foreign policy and the calculus of Sri Lanka's national interests, there are, broadly speaking, two types of factors. There are the factors that stem from geopolitics, from the facts of our location, who we are, where we are, what we are. A relatively small island on the doorstep of India. An island where the southern two-thirds are dominated by one ethnic community, the majority, and the top one-third is primarily occupied by another ethnic community, which has 70 million co-ethnics across the water in Tamil Nadu. Now, those things are not going to change. Now, therefore, there are certain constants in Sri Lanka's situation, and foreign policy has to be constructed taking those constants into account. There are also certain dynamics, certain variables, certain novelties, which are characteristic of the 21st century or the age in which we live. Now, my submission, ladies and gentlemen, is that in the post-war period, Sri Lanka has badly mishandled both the constants and the variables. And it is this mishandling, stemming perhaps from misperception, that has resulted in the crisis in Sri Lanka's external relations. And the barometer of that crisis is the vote in Geneva. Let me remind you that while certain states that have been constant friends of Sri Lanka are no longer members, the UN Human Rights Council has an inbuilt structural majority for the countries of the global south. 33 of 47 members come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and that is because the institutionalization package ensured that the respective proportions of the regions of the world would be respected in the composition of the Council. And since I had the privilege of being a Vice President of the Human Rights Council at the time, representing Asia, I have an intimate knowledge of how this came about. Now, why then has Sri Lanka succeeded in losing a vote, having won one rather handsomely in 2009? In 3 years, it lost. And right now, it is staring defeat or capitulation in the face as we speak. The reason stems from what I said before, that both the constants or the long-term structural and systemic factors as well as the dynamic factors have been misread, misperceived, and mishandled. The axial relationship that Sri Lanka has with the external world is that with India. This does not mean that Sri Lanka has to be a satellite of India. What this means is that Sri Lanka has to understand that the permanent tendency towards hostility towards Sri Lanka, which is a fluctuating tendency in Tamil Nadu, can and will have an impact on Delhi and can therefore tilt India from being a buffer, which it was during the last war, to being on the fence, and then beyond that, perhaps, to moving towards the situation that we had in the 1980s of an adversarial stance. Now, how can the extremists in Tamil Nadu be dealt with? They can only be dealt with by the use of the well-known doctrine of the balance of power, which means helping the moderates in Tamil Nadu balance off the extremists and helping Delhi balance off Chennai or Tamil Nadu. Now, how can this be done? There is no way, ladies and gentlemen, around this but to stick to the grand bargain that was struck between the two states in 1987 when these factors were in play. M.G. Ramachandran in Tamil Nadu, Rajiv Gandhi in New Delhi, and President Jayawardena in Sri Lanka. And it is that grand bargain that de-linked Delhi from Tamil militancy and in fact turned it against Tamil militancy. And that at the heart of the grand bargain was provincial level devolution as codified in the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lanka Constitution. Now, I won't go into the issue of devolution, but I'm merely touching upon it as not to debate its intrinsic worth, but to emphasize that it is an inescapable part of any successful attempt to balance off the moderates in Tamil Nadu against the extremists and to balance off Delhi against or in relation to Tamil Nadu. It is the only way to strengthen Delhi's hand, as it was strengthened in 2009 by our solemn promises made at the presidential level to implement the 13th Amendment. But we have weakened that firebreak which enabled Delhi to contain the militancy, the radicalism in Tamil Nadu. We must learn to help our friends help us, and even if we don't consider them constant or consistent friends, we must help our vacillatory friends to vacillate in our direction, rather than that of those who are hostile to us, really. Now, the relationship with India, I repeat, is axial. We have no realistic options other than managing that relationship prudently. There is no United States option, as Jayawardena found out in the 1980s, and right now there isn't one because there is a strategic alliance between India and the United States, though there is some daylight there, which is probably why the Indian position on the resolution is a little more helpful than that of some of the Western states. Now, there's no Chinese option either. China is a very serious, mature power, which has absolutely no intention of making the mistake that Nikita Khrushchev did and being strung out, overstretched along a completely untenable supply line, eyeballing it with India on India's doorstep. This is just not going to happen. And there are reasons that my fellow ambassadors know that certainly the Chinese have given no indication of that kind of open-ended commitment. They are very, very pragmatic and mature people. So we have no realistic option but to manage the relationship with India, and that means managing our relationship with Sri Lanka's Tamil community. Now, it is often said, look, this is a purely internal problem. It stopped, but that is sheer nonsense. It stopped being a purely internal problem in the 1980s. Yeah. As my father, the late Mervyn de Silva, once wrote, in this age of identity, ethnicity walks on water. There is no way that we can seal off the sentiments of the Tamil people of Tamil Nadu from those of who they consider their co-ethnics in Sri Lanka. So, I shall conclude with this thought. With a thought and what I don't usually do, one quote, if I may. The thought is this. We are in a state of extreme crisis of our external relations, and that crisis stems from an enormous and growing divergence in discourse and in mentality and in model between post-war Sri Lanka, the dominant ethos of the regime today, and the rest of the world. By the rest of the world, I am not talking about the West, because we never had the votes of the West, certainly in Geneva. But I am talking about our neighborhood, and I am talking about Asia, Africa, and Latin America, especially Latin America, which is very sensitive on issues of governance, human rights, and democracy, having come out of authoritarian regimes themselves. It is perfectly possible for us to get out of this crisis. The way to do that is to reapply what I call the Kadirgama doctrine. And the Kadirgama doctrine had two relevant postulates, relevant to us at this moment. One was that he was able to, and he demonstrated the capacity, to balance adroitly between the United States, India, and China with, I shall admit, a necessary marginal tilt to China. And I still think that we need a marginal tilt to Russia and China because they share our views on sovereignty. The second postulate of the Kadirgama doctrine was the defense of sovereignty, the advocacy of a Sri Lankan identity, and the strong advocacy of devolution. It's a triad. This is the way to get out of the crisis and to prevent those forces that are hostile to Sri Lanka from winning the Cold War. And this is the only way to prevent us from losing the peace. I shall conclude with a quote from perhaps a leading thinker on foreign policy, the most influential in today's world, Professor Joseph Nye, whom I was privileged to have a friendly exchange with last year in Paris. I quote, "It was usually the case that whoever had the biggest army won. But on the stage of international politics today, we need to be aware that the winners are those with the best arguments. In this era of readily available information, soft power has as much talent to persuade, attract, or convince people as hard power has to force them." I end quote. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.